Have you ever wondered how close you've come to danger without even realizing it? At Shivering Vault, we take you there, one story at a time. But before you drift off, consider liking this video and commenting where you're watching from. Now, let's dive into these chilling stories. I've never been so scared in my life. When I look back on it now, it's like everything started out so normal. It was just a road trip, a weekend getaway with a few friends. It was supposed to be fun, nothing too crazy, just the kind of trip that leaves you with good memories and cool photos for social media. But everything changed the moment we took that detour. And what started as a simple, innocent drive down a dusty California back road turned into something I'll never be able to forget. Let me start at the beginning. My name's Dave. I'm just your average guy, mid-20s, a little too much into hiking, a little too much into craft beer. I like to think I have a decent sense of adventure, but even I wasn't prepared for what happened that day. It all started when my friends and I decided to take a road trip through California. We had been driving for hours, taking the scenic route along the coast, stopping here and there to grab a bite or explore a small town. It was supposed to be a relaxing weekend, nothing too intense, just some good times with good friends. There was me, of course, Jake, my college buddy who always thought he was the bravest of the group, Katie, who was usually the voice of reason, but also kind of a skeptic when it came to anything that wasn't safe, and Sam, the adventurous one, who always pushed us to do stupid stuff, but in the best way possible. We were a few hours out of town, deep into the California backroads, when we passed a dirt road that seemed like it came out of nowhere. It wasn't on any of our maps, and there wasn't even a sign pointing to it. Just this narrow, bumpy path winding off the highway into what looked like the middle of nowhere. Jake was the first to speak up. "Hey, check that out. Want to see where it goes?" Katie hesitated, glancing at the road nervously. "I don't know. We're already pretty far off the main highway. We might not make it back before dark." Sam piped up from the back seat. "Come on, where's your sense of adventure? It's just a dirt road. We'll be fine." Honestly, I wasn't feeling too great about it either, but I didn't want to be the wet blanket. Plus, we were getting kind of bored from the long drive. So against my better judgment, I said, "All right, let's check it out." I'd like to say that we didn't know what we were getting ourselves into, but deep down, I think we all had that feeling, that nagging sense that something wasn't quite right. We turned down the dirt road, and immediately, things felt different. It was quiet. Too quiet. There wasn't a single car in sight, not even the usual distant hum of traffic. Just the sound of our tires crunching over gravel and dirt, the soft thrum of the engine. The road started to get narrower and more uneven, the grass along the sides taller and more overgrown. It felt like we were slowly leaving civilization behind. Every now and then, I'd glance out the window, seeing nothing but thick trees and dry brush. The farther we drove, the more unsettling it became. The sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the road, turning everything a pale orange. The temperature seemed to drop just a bit, enough to make me shiver. Eventually, we came across an old gas station. The kind of place you'd expect to see in a post-apocalyptic movie. If you didn't know better, you'd think it had been abandoned for decades. The station was off to the side of the road, just barely visible behind a grove of dead trees and some rusted-out signs. It was one of those old-style gas stations from the 50s or 60s, with faded red and yellow signs and peeling paint. At first glance, it didn't look like anyone had been here for years. The building itself was barely standing, cracks in the walls, broken windows covered with boards, and a broken-down roof that had clearly seen better days. The gas pumps were rusted over, surrounded by tall, dry weeds that had begun to reclaim the space. It was the kind of place you'd expect to see in a horror movie. And for some reason, I felt that creeping unease crawling up my spine. But we were already there. We didn't have anywhere else to go. Jake was the first one to jump out of the car. "Dude, this place is perfect for some photos," he said, walking towards the crumbling building. "Imagine how cool this will look on Instagram. It's totally abandoned." Katie's face twisted into a skeptical frown. "I don't know. This place gives me the creeps. I mean, it looks like it's been abandoned for years." I felt the same way. There was something about the place that just didn't sit right. The air was thick with the smell of decay, like old metal and rot. There were no sounds, no birds chirping, no wind rustling the trees, just silence. Sam, ever the adventurer, nudged me. "You in, Dave? Come on, it'll be fun." And like an idiot, I agreed. Sure, why not? We decided to split up to explore. Jake and Sam headed towards the front of the station where the old convenience store was attached. Katie and I walked around the back, hoping to find something interesting there. The back of the building was even worse than the front. It looked like no one had bothered to touch the place in decades. Weeds grew up through cracks in the concrete, and broken bottles and trash were scattered everywhere. The smell was even worse back here, moldy and musty, like the building had been abandoned during a rainstorm and never dried out. Katie stopped, looking around with a worried expression. "Dave, this is too much. Something's wrong here. I feel like we shouldn't be here." I agreed with her, but I didn't say anything. There was no obvious danger, and just that overwhelming feeling of something not being right. I thought about turning back, but Sam and Jake were already getting too far ahead. They were already inside the store, laughing and joking like they hadn't noticed how strange the place felt. Then I saw it. Toward the end of the building, near a small alley between the station and a decrepit shed, there was an old truck. I swear it wasn't there when we first arrived. The faded red paint had long since peeled off, leaving it rusted and covered in dirt. It was parked with its back facing the alley, but the thing that struck me the most was that the engine was running. I hadn't heard it start up, hadn't seen anyone get out, but there it was, idling, as if someone was waiting. Katie noticed it too. "That wasn't there before, was it?" I shook my head, feeling my stomach tighten. "No, it wasn't. Let's go. Now." We turned to leave, but then we heard tires screeching. The truck had suddenly pulled forward, blocking the only way out. My heart stopped. My breath caught in my throat. "Hey!" Jake yelled from the front. "What the hell's going on? Why is there a truck blocking the road?" Before anyone could respond, a man stepped out from behind the truck. He was tall, broad, and wearing a heavy, worn jacket. His face was in shadow, but I could see his eyes, dark, cold, and unblinking. "You kids lost?" he asked, his voice low and flat. It wasn't a question. It was a statement, like he already knew the answer. Panic shot through me. I froze. My mind was racing, thinking about how we could get away. But before I could react, another man appeared behind him, walking slowly from the shadows of the gas station. This one was thinner, wearing a dirt-streaked baseball cap, and he was carrying something in his hand, something long, thin, and metallic. A crowbar? A pipe? I looked at Katie, and I could see the fear in her eyes. She wasn't scared of much, but this was different. "We should go," she whispered, but I wasn't sure if I could even move. I don't know what would have happened if Jake hadn't made a run for it. He yelled something and bolted for the car, but before he even got halfway, the first man grabbed Sam by the arm and pulled him toward the truck. Sam screamed, but it wasn't the kind of scream you hear in a movie. It was real. It was desperate. Katie and I rushed forward, but the second man stepped in front of us, blocking our way. It was like a nightmare unfolding in real time. Sam fought back, kicking and struggling, but the man was too strong. For a moment, it felt like time had stopped. Then, everything happened at once. Jake had reached the car. He was already in the driver's seat, slamming the car into reverse, throwing it backward toward the dirt path. I ran. I ran harder than I've ever run before in my life, with Katie right behind me. My heart pounded in my ears, my legs felt like they were going to give out, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. We reached the car, threw ourselves into the back seat, and Jake peeled out, spinning the tires and kicking up dirt as we sped away. We didn't speak much the rest of the way home. Sam was breathing hard, covered in sweat, but at least he was with us. We didn't talk about what had happened. We didn't need to. The only thing I knew for sure was that we had been lucky. I'll never forget that feeling. The way I felt when we were trapped, like prey, knowing there was nowhere to run. If we hadn't fought back, if we hadn't been lucky enough to escape, I don't want to think about that. The next time I see a dirt road off a highway, I won't be curious. I won't even blink. I'll keep my eyes straight ahead and drive on, because some things are better left unexplored. I've always considered myself pretty level-headed. I don't get spooked easily, at least. That's what I tell myself. I'm a 29-year-old woman living alone in a small town in California, a place so quiet it could almost be mistaken for a painting. My house is simple, nothing grand, just a modest two-bedroom with a small yard. The street is lined with houses like mine, neat, unassuming, nestled in the calm of suburban life. The world here operates on a slower rhythm. It's peaceful, a tranquility I had grown used to. It was quiet in a way that was almost comforting, and for a long time I embraced it. That was until one night everything changed. It started as most nights do, with the fading sunlight. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in a deep burnt orange hue. It's that fleeting moment when the world pauses, somewhere between day and night, where everything feels still. I had just finished up my work for the day and was heading to the kitchen to prepare dinner, one of those simple routines that I took comfort in. I was alone, as usual. Alone by choice, if I'm being honest, since I enjoyed the solitude. There's something calming about knowing no one else is around to interrupt your space. My house was familiar to me. Its creaks, its smells, the way the floorboards groaned in certain spots when I walked across them. Everything was exactly how it always was. The predictability of life was soothing, and I had no reason to expect anything to break that peaceful pattern. I had just finished dinner and was lounging on the couch in the living room, mindlessly flipping through channels. It was just about 11 p.m. The outside world seemed to be holding its breath. There was no wind rustling the trees, no distant sound of traffic or even voices. It was the kind of silence that could be a little unsettling if you listened for too long. The crickets chirped incessantly outside, but they were the only sound, and even they seemed to fade into the background. I was content, relaxed even, drifting through channels, not really watching anything in particular. Then, it happened. Without any warning, the lights went out. There wasn't the usual flicker, the subtle hum of electricity failing. It was as if someone had slammed a switch. One moment, the television was playing, the soft buzz of the screen filling the room, and the next, everything went black. The silence that followed was almost suffocating. It wasn't the normal kind of quiet. No appliances humming, no faint light from the streetlights outside filtering through the curtains. It was as though the house had exhaled and then held its breath. For a second, I sat there, staring at the blank TV screen, utterly disoriented. Was it a power surge, a fuse blown, a storm maybe? I wasn't sure. I checked my phone, still sitting on the coffee table, and grabbed it to turn on the flashlight. The weak beam illuminated the living room in an eerie, dim light, flickering intermittently. I couldn't shake the feeling that the dark had become oppressive, heavy, like it was pressing in on me from all directions. My heart began to race, and I told myself I was overreacting. Okay, it's just the power, I muttered under my breath, trying to calm myself down. It's probably nothing. But the silence lingered longer than I was comfortable with, thick and unyielding, as if the house itself was holding some kind of secret. I could feel my body tense, a slow, creeping unease taking over. The world outside my little bubble of light seemed distant now, and it didn't feel as safe anymore. I stood up, slowly, my legs a little shaky, as if my body was responding to something I couldn't see. The house felt different without the comforting hum of lights or the glow of street lamps through the windows. It wasn't just dark, it felt empty. And it was then that I started to feel it. The feeling of presence, a sensation that gnawed at the edges of my mind, telling me I wasn't alone in this house. It was a chilling thought. I hesitated, taking a breath, trying to reassure myself. There was no logical reason to be afraid. It was just a power outage, right? But the longer I stood there, the more I realized that the darkness was no longer just an absence of light. It was almost tangible, like the air had thickened, and with it, the shadows in every corner of the room seemed to stretch deeper. I made my way down the hallway to the fuse box, knowing full well the light switches wouldn't work. Maybe it was a tripped breaker, or perhaps a transformer in the area had gone down. As I moved through the house, the stillness was unsettling, but it wasn't the silence that got to me. It was the feeling that something else was waiting in the dark. Something I couldn't see but could almost feel. The air around me felt thick, suffocating, pressing in from all sides. And then the sound came. A soft thud coming from deeper in the house near the kitchen, I thought. My breath caught in my throat, my feet froze. For a split second, I tried to convince myself that it was just the house settling. Old houses make noises all the time. But then it came again. A second thud. But this time, it wasn't just a bump or a creak. It was different. It was a dragging sound, slow and deliberate, like something heavy was being moved across the floor. That was when the panic set in. Cold, creeping fear that made my skin prickle. My legs shook, but for some reason, I moved forward. My instincts screamed at me to run, but instead, I crept down the hallway, the beam of my flashlight shaking wildly in my hand, illuminating the floor in erratic bursts. My mind raced, running through 1,000 scenarios, all of them bad. It felt as though the walls themselves were pressing in, suffocating me with each step. I turned the corner into the kitchen. The flashlight flickered, its light barely cutting through the oppressive darkness. In the dim beam, the room seemed foreign to me. The usual details were lost in the shadows, and I could only make out faint outlines. The refrigerator, the stove. The things I knew so well now felt alien. It was then that I saw it, or rather, saw him. At first, it was nothing more than a vague shape in my peripheral vision. Just a shadow moving in the corner. My heart skipped a beat, and my breath hitched in my throat. I froze. My mind screamed for me to run, but my feet refused to obey. I held my breath, praying I was imagining it. But no, the shape was there, and it wasn't a trick of the light. A figure, standing still, blending into the darkness. My flashlight flickered again, and I stepped closer, drawn toward it. Something inside me told me to turn and flee, but I couldn't. The figure didn't move. It was just there, standing. Then, just as quickly as I saw it, the shape disappeared. Vanished into thin air. I blinked, trying to process what I had seen, but before I could even make sense of it, I heard it, a scraping sound, a chair dragging across the floor, slow and deliberate, coming from the exact same corner where the figure had been standing. My pulse thundered in my ears, and panic surged through me like a flood. My thoughts scattered, but the one thing I knew for sure was that I was not alone. I turned, my heart racing, my legs moving faster than I thought possible. I sprinted back down the hallway, the sound of my own heartbeat drowning out everything else. My feet pounded the floor as I rushed toward the safety of my bedroom. I barely remembered locking the door behind me or pressing my phone to my ear. I was barely able to choke out the words to the 911 operator. I whispered that someone had broken into my house, my voice trembling, barely audible over the rush of fear in my chest. The operator assured me help was on the way, but each second stretched out into an eternity. Every sound outside my bedroom door made my blood run cold. Every creak of the floorboards, every shift in the air felt like a threat. My breath came in shallow bursts, and I huddled in the corner, clutching my phone like a lifeline, the flashlight trembling in my hand. 10 minutes. It felt like hours before I heard the distant wail of sirens. When they reached the house, it was like a beacon of safety, a rope thrown to pull me out of the darkness. The officers moved quickly through the house, checking every room. Their presence brought some comfort, but the fear didn't dissipate. And then they found him, in the kitchen. He was crouched low, hiding behind the counter, the dim light barely catching his face. His eyes were wide, vacant, but cold, unnervingly calm. A knife still clutched in his hand. The officers quickly restrained him, but I couldn't shake the look in his eyes. It was the look of someone who had done this before. The look of someone who wasn't rattled by fear, but fed by it. After they took him away, the house felt impossibly still. I could still hear the faint echo of his footsteps, even though he was gone. The fear didn't leave with him. In fact, it only settled deeper into my bones. And from that night on, whenever the power went out, even for just a second, my heart would race, my mind would spiral. I couldn't help it. I checked the locks more than I wanted to admit, knowing that nothing felt as safe as it used to. The quiet, peaceful nights were no longer comforting. They were just reminders. Reminders that no matter how still the night seemed, darkness could hide things and people I would never see coming. I live in a small 2-bedroom house on the outskirts of a suburban neighborhood in California. Nothing fancy, just a cozy little place where I've spent the last few years of my life since I started college. It's the kind of neighborhood where people wave as they drive by and there's rarely ever any kind of trouble. The houses are spread out with lots of trees and wide sidewalks, the kind of place where you can take a walk late at night and feel safe. Or so I thought. My name's Sarah, and I'm a 22-year-old college student. Most of my friends live a few towns over, so I spend a lot of time at home. It's not bad, though. I've gotten used to the quiet. I spend my evenings either doing homework or watching Netflix, especially now that I'm preparing for a big biology exam. That night, I was sitting at my desk in my room, reading through my notes, trying to cram as much information into my brain as I could before I passed out from exhaustion. It was around 1 a.m. when I heard the first sound. I had been so focused on my work that I didn't notice how late it was getting, but when I looked at the clock on my wall, it took me a moment to process that it was already past midnight. I yawned and rubbed my eyes, but I couldn't bring myself to go to bed just yet. I had to finish one more chapter before I could finally sleep. The house was quiet, too quiet. I hadn't heard a sound in ages, not even the hum of the fridge in the kitchen. Then it came, a soft click, a metallic sound, the back door. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. Maybe the wind had blown something outside, but no, there it was again, the unmistakable sound of a lock turning. I froze. My heart started to race, and I instinctively glanced toward the window. The moonlight barely illuminated the driveway, and the streetlights cast long shadows on the pavement. Everything looked still. Everything looked normal. But I knew I had locked the door earlier that evening. I always do, without fail. My mom used to joke about how I was overly paranoid about security, but I didn't care. After a few break-ins had happened in the neighborhood a couple of months back, I made sure every door and window was locked every single night. I couldn't ignore it anymore. That noise was too distinct to be anything else. The back door, someone was trying to open it. I stayed as still as I could, my heart thudding in my chest. My mind raced. Should I go check? No, that's ridiculous. If someone's out there, They'll know I'm awake. But I couldn't just ignore it. Slowly, I got up from my desk, trying to make as little noise as possible. My bare feet pressed softly into the carpeted floor. I crept to the edge of my room and peeked out into the hallway. The dim light from my lamp cast long shadows down the corridor, and everything seemed perfectly still. But I knew better. Something wasn't right. I hesitated, trying to figure out what to do. My thoughts scrambled. I couldn't hear anything now. No more clicking or turning of locks. Had they gotten inside already? Were they in the house? I slowly made my way down the hallway toward the stairs leading to the back door. The house felt cold now, the air thick and still. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was there, waiting. It felt like my chest was getting tighter with each step I took. I stopped at the top of the stairs and squinted into the dark hallway below. The kitchen door was only a few feet from the bottom of the stairs. It was always left ajar, so the soft light from the kitchen spilled into the hallway, barely enough to make out shapes. The door was just barely open, and I could see the faint outline of the kitchen beyond, but something was off. The door was supposed to be shut. I held my breath and waited. Silence. Then I heard it. A footstep. No, 2 footsteps. They were faint, almost like someone was trying to be quiet. I knew it wasn't my mom. She wasn't supposed to be back from her trip for another day, and she would have called first. My stomach churned, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Someone was in the kitchen. I carefully descended the stairs, trying to make as little noise as possible, my pulse quickening with each step. I had to find out who it was, but I knew I couldn't just rush in. Whoever was in there could be dangerous. I reached the bottom of the stairs and paused. The kitchen was quiet now. Too quiet. I could feel the presence of someone else in the room. I could sense them, even though I couldn't see them yet. The kitchen door was still cracked open, and the light inside was dim, casting eerie shadows across the room. The air felt colder now, and a shiver ran down my spine. I had no idea what I was going to find. Taking a deep breath, I slowly moved forward, my body trembling. I was so close now, just a few steps away from the kitchen. I was close enough that I could almost hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. I felt like I might pass out from fear. I peered through the crack in the door. At first, I didn't see anything. The room was empty. But then I saw a shadow, a figure standing at the far end of the kitchen near the sink. My breath caught in my throat. The figure was tall, unnaturally still. My first thought was that maybe it was just a shadow from the kitchen light, but no. There was a person there, in my house. A man. He was standing by the counter, facing away from me, but I could make out the outline of his body. He was holding something in his hand, a knife. My blood ran cold. The metal blade caught the light as he shifted it in his hand, turning it over, testing its weight. I didn't know if he was aware of my presence, but I couldn't take any chances. My legs felt like jelly, but I knew I had to act fast. If I screamed or tried to run, he would hear me. I'd be trapped. I needed to stay calm. I quickly backed up a few steps, my mind racing. What should I do? I couldn't call the cops. If he heard me, it might be too late. But there was one thing I had, the pepper spray my mom had given me a few months ago. She had bought it for me when I moved into this house, saying, "Better safe than sorry." At the time, I had laughed it off. I'd never actually thought I would need it. But now, in that moment, it was the only thing I had that could help. I crept back to my room as quietly as I could, my feet barely making a sound. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the pepper spray. I grabbed it from my desk, clutching it tightly in my palm. I had to be quick. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, and then, without thinking twice, I made my move. I bolted down the hallway, back to the stairs, and then into the kitchen. I didn't look back. I didn't think. I just acted. I rushed into the kitchen, my heart racing, and sprayed the pepper spray directly at the man's face. He let out a sharp, strangled yell, stumbling backward and dropping the knife. The spray hit him square in the face, and he collapsed to the floor, gagging and coughing, his eyes watering. I didn't stop. I ran straight for the back door, throwing it open with all my strength, and screamed at the top of my lungs, "Help! Somebody! Help me!" The man didn't chase me. He didn't even try to fight back. He was too disoriented. I could see him stumbling out the back door, wiping his eyes in agony as he stumbled into the yard. I didn't look back to see where he went. I just ran. I didn't stop screaming until I was outside, standing in the middle of the yard, shivering from the cold air and the shock. I didn't care that I was barefoot. I didn't care about anything except the fact that I was alive. The police arrived minutes later. I told them everything, how I had heard the door unlocking, how I had seen the man with the knife, how I had sprayed him with the pepper spray. They searched the yard and the surrounding area and found him hiding in the neighbor's shed. He was still clutching his face, half blinded by the spray. They arrested him, and it turned out he had been targeting random houses in the area, but this was the first time he had actually been caught. I never found out exactly what he was after, money, valuables, or something else, but I wasn't about to stick around to find out. The whole thing felt like a nightmare. I still can't believe it happened. It felt so surreal, like something from a movie. I kept asking myself, what would have happened if I hadn't been awake that night, if I hadn't heard the back door? What if I had been asleep, completely unaware? I try not to dwell on it too much, but it's hard not to. Sometimes when it's quiet in the house, I still hear the sound of that door unlocking, and I'm right back in that moment, heart racing, waiting for the worst to happen. And every time my heart stops for just a second. I'll never forget that night. It started like any other drive home after a long weekend away. I had spent the past couple of days up north in California, catching up with an old friend and enjoying the peace and quiet of the mountains. The fresh mountain air, the crisp mornings, and the nights spent by the campfire had all been perfect, a much-needed escape from the grind of everyday life. But now, with the trip over, it was time to head to my apartment in Southern California. This meant a long stretch of highway through some of the most desolate and isolated parts of the state. The night had already fallen by the time I began my journey home. It was around 10:45 p.m. when I passed the last small town, and I still had a couple of hours to go before I'd get back to the familiar lights and noise of the city. The highway stretched out in front of me like an endless ribbon of blacktop, bathed in darkness, except for the occasional flicker of my headlights reflecting off distant road signs. There were no streetlights, no cars on the road, and I hadn't seen another soul for miles. I felt like I was driving through a never-ending void, where the world seemed to fall away as the seconds dragged on. The silence outside my car was eerie. The hum of the engine was the only sound keeping me company, but it wasn't enough to distract me from the growing fatigue in my body. The trip had been long, and I could feel the exhaustion creeping in. My eyelids were heavy, and I had to fight the urge to close them. Every now and then I rubbed my eyes, trying to shake off the tiredness, but it was no use. The road seemed to stretch on forever, with no end in sight, and the dark landscape outside my window was just a blur of empty fields and the occasional signpost. There wasn't a single thing to keep me engaged or alert. That's when I saw it. In the distance, through the dark, a small light appeared, a faint glow that broke the monotony of the night. It was a gas station. I squinted, thinking I was seeing things, but no. There it was, a beacon in the middle of nowhere. My gas gauge was dangerously low, and I wasn't about to risk running out of fuel in the middle of this desolation. I needed to stop, and this station was the only option for miles. As I drew closer, I couldn't shake the unsettling feeling in my chest. The gas station didn't look like the usual clean, well-maintained rest stops I was used to. No, this one looked abandoned. The flickering neon sign above the pumps was old and worn, like it hadn't been used in years. The light from the sign buzzed erratically, casting an eerie glow on the cracked pavement. There was no other car in sight, and the only lights came from the station itself. The building was a rundown shack, its wooden slats peeling off the walls, windows cracked and dirty, and a faded open sign hanging crookedly at the entrance, as though someone had put it up half-heartedly years ago. I hesitated. My gut told me this was the kind of place you'd rather not stop, but the reality was that I didn't have much choice. I pulled my car up to the nearest pump, making sure to keep my headlights on just in case I needed to make a quick escape. The moment I stepped out of the car, the air hit me, sharp and biting. The cold seemed to seep right through my jacket, and I instinctively pulled it tighter around me. It wasn't freezing, but the emptiness of the place made it feel much colder than it should have. The silence was deafening. No wind, no rustling trees, not even the distant hum of traffic. Just me, alone in the dark at a forgotten gas station in the middle of nowhere. I locked the car door and walked toward the pump, my footsteps echoing on the pavement. Every corner of my mind screamed at me to leave, but my fuel tank was too close to empty for me to turn back now. As I pumped the gas, I kept glancing around, my unease growing with every passing second. The whole area felt abandoned, like nobody had stopped here in years. The faint hum of the neon lights overhead was the only noise, a constant reminder of how far removed I was from civilization. I tried to push the unease aside, telling myself it was just my imagination running wild, but the emptiness was so oppressive that it gnawed at me, making my heart race faster than it should have. And that's when I saw him. At first, I thought I was imagining things, that my tired eyes were playing tricks on me. But no, there he was, standing by the edge of the lot, his silhouette dark against the night. He wasn't moving, just standing there with his hands shoved into the pockets of his long, dark jacket. I couldn't make out his face clearly, but I could feel his eyes on me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, a chill running down my spine. There was something off about the way he stood there, almost too still, like he was waiting for something, or someone. I quickly turned my attention back to the gas pump, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching me. I finished filling my tank and started walking back to my car, hoping to get back in and drive away without any further incident. But as I moved, I saw him again. This time he was walking toward me, slowly, deliberately. There was no rush in his steps, just a steady, unbroken pace as though he knew exactly where he was going. And he was coming straight for me. I stopped in my tracks, my heart skipped a beat, and I felt the blood drain from my face. My instincts screamed at me to get in the car, lock the doors, and drive away as fast as possible. But I couldn't. I was rooted to the spot, frozen by some primal fear that I couldn't explain. He was close now, and I could see more details. He was tall, maybe in his mid-30s, with dark, unkempt hair that fell over his forehead. His face was gaunt, drawn, as if he hadn't eaten or slept in days. His skin was pale, almost sickly looking, and his eyes, those eyes, they were the worst part. There was something about them that made my stomach churn. They were empty, distant, as if he wasn't really looking at me, but rather through me. It was a hollow, unsettling gaze, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't all there. "Hey!" he said, his voice low and rough, like he hadn't spoken in days. The words seemed to rasp out of his throat with little effort, but they hit me like a cold slap. "You heading south?" I nodded stiffly, not sure how to respond, too uneasy to make small talk. "Yeah, just a bit further down the road," I mumbled, trying to sound casual, but the words felt strange in my mouth. He didn't seem to care about my answer. Instead, he took another step toward me, his boots thudding softly on the cracked pavement. "Mind if I ask for a ride?" My stomach dropped. The casualness of his tone, the way he phrased the question, sent a jolt of terror through me. Everything inside me screamed that something wasn't right. My gut told me to run, to lock the car and drive away as fast as I could. I'm sorry, I said, forcing the words out, my voice trembling slightly. But I'm not going that way. It's a long drive ahead, and I don't really know you. His eyes didn't shift. They just stayed locked on mine, that eerie emptiness still there. Without a word, he took another step forward, closing the distance between us. Come on, he said, his voice almost pleading now, but in a way that felt off, like he was trying to coax me into something. Just a few miles. I'm not asking for much. I took another step back, my fingers instinctively wrapping around the door handle of my car. I was already beginning to panic, my heart pounding in my chest. The way he moved, the way he spoke, it was all wrong. He wasn't acting like someone who needed help. He was acting like someone who knew exactly what they wanted, and I wasn't sure I wanted to be a part of it. I really can't, I said, my voice a little firmer now, though still shaky. You're better off just calling someone. There's a town not far down the road. He stopped. The smile that had been creeping across his face faded away, and his eyes narrowed. His head tilted slightly, as if trying to figure me out, like I was some kind of puzzle he couldn't solve. The moment stretched on, the tension hanging heavy in the air, as though time itself had slowed down. The wind had stopped, and the only sound was the faint buzz of the neon lights. For a moment, I thought maybe he would turn and leave. But then his hand darted out, and in that split second, I saw the glint of metal. My stomach dropped. I realized what it was, a knife. He pulled it from his jacket, the blade gleaming in the dim light. A cold wave of panic washed over me. I froze, unsure of what to do, my mind scrambling for a plan. But before I could even fully process the situation, he took another step closer, his presence suffocating, the gleam of the knife burning into my mind. I think you will help me, he said, his voice now cold, demanding. Fear coursed through me like a surge of electricity. My breath caught in my throat, and every part of me screamed to run. Without thinking, I scrambled to the car, fumbling with the door handle in a panic, my heart pounding in my chest. My hands were shaking so badly that I almost couldn't get the door open. But finally, I managed to get inside, slamming it shut behind me. My fingers were still trembling as I jammed the key into the ignition. The car roared to life, and without a second thought, I slammed my foot on the gas pedal, speeding out of the gas station lot. The tires screeched on the cracked pavement as I drove as fast as I could, my mind racing. I didn't dare look back as I sped down the highway. The road was dark and empty, and my heart pounded so loudly in my chest that I could barely hear the engine. But I could feel him behind me, just out of sight, like some shadow trailing me in the night, waiting for the right moment to strike. Glancing in the rearview mirror, I saw him. He was running after me, his arms pumping in the air as he sprinted down the road. My blood turned to ice. He wasn't giving up. In blind panic, I swerved suddenly, the tires screeching as I took a sharp turn onto an old, barely visible side road. The car lurched violently, the wheels grinding over loose gravel as I slammed on the brakes, sending my body hurtling forward against the seatbelt. The car came to a screeching halt. I sat there for a moment, gasping for breath, my heart still pounding in my chest. Everything was still. The night was silent. I didn't dare move, didn't dare even look around. My mind was in a fog, too afraid to process what had just happened. After what felt like an eternity, I slowly lifted my head and looked ahead. The road stretched out before me, empty, desolate, and silent. I didn't wait to find out if he was still following me. I slammed my foot down on the gas pedal, pushing the car into a reckless speed, and I didn't stop until I knew for sure that I was far away, safe. I didn't even look in the rearview mirror again. I never stopped at another gas station like that again. That's it for today's tale from Shivering Vault. If you have a story worth sharing, drop it in the comments or send it our way. Don't forget to subscribe and share with your fellow thrill seekers. As always, the Shivering Vault thanks you for unlocking today's tale. Until next time, the vault awaits your return.